those of you who are regulars to this inconsistent land that is my YouTube channel may be intimately familiar with open and closed source software. However, I think us tech guys who are always in the know, or always fiddling about with computers, Linux, that kind of thing, we tend to forget that the majority of people, the vast majority of people, have no idea about closed source software or open source software, and while the names kind of give away their meaning, I thought maybe we should do a little bit of a deep dive, a little bit of an explanation to those who might not know what they mean. Open and closed source software refers to the openness, the accessibility of the code base for the piece of software that you're looking at. For example, Windows, Firefox, Google Chrome, Photoshop, basically anything that runs on something. Closed source is often also referred to as proprietary software. Now, if you were to Google that, or if you were to just go off of that, you would think it's just all software that nobody other than those who are allowed to have access to it, which is pretty much exactly right. Usually, a closed source application that you would have heard of is owned by a large company, an organization, but that is not always the case. It doesn't take a certain amount of people for a piece of software to become closed source. If you make a program for literally anything, calculator for example in Java, release that but keep the code base locked away, i.e. you don't release the source code, then that is a piece of closed source software. Popular examples like, Netflix, or the entire Adobe suite, they're all examples of closed source software. Now, there are various pros and cons to closed source software, the biggest of which is your lack of direct ownership of the software because it's closed source. So if you, say, violated your license for some Adobe products, they can just revoke your access to it, and you've got no way of really getting that access back. It's more often than not, closed source software is always paid for. I say almost always because there are pieces of closed source software that are free. For example, DaVinci Resolve, that has a free version that's financially free, not free in terms of, GNU. So, but you don't have access to the source code, but it is free to download. And from that definition of closed source software, you can definitely figure out what open source is. It's just the opposite. So open source software has the code base freely available for the public to look at. Now, the specific license agreements of open source software changes depending on who's developed the software. So you might be able to make your own changes to an open source piece of software. Depending on the licenses, you might not. Well, you might not be able to edit it and then release it under your own name as the author. Open source examples of software, Firefox, the Linux kernel, Blender, GIMP, Inkscape, these are all examples of open source software. The kind of creative stuff. LibreOffice as well, that's open source, which enables you and other companies as well to download these pieces of software and their code bases, then make their own changes. And in the example of a company, for example, they could download LibreOffice, get on LibreWriter, analyze the source code and implement their own changes, release that as their own version of LibreOffice, and then they could use that within their own company or send it somewhere else. A lot of the time, these pieces of software will disallow you from selling your version. So what some of these open source licenses grant you the ability to do is you're allowed to change it, and then you're allowed to distribute it, but you're not allowed to then close the source code off and then sell it as closed source software. Now, some pieces of software do let you do that, which is, fine. Some of them don't. So if you are going to ever dive into these things, it's always good to just read upon the license just in case. But I'm guessing 99% of people here don't plan on looking up VLC source code and trying to sell it off as their own video player. You probably wouldn't get that far. Here's a few pros and cons that I've come up with from the mind of the average person, right? So if you're looking at examples of open and closed source software, one thing that might come to your mind is that closed source software is often a lot more polished, mainstream maybe. I mean, if you list off some of the most popular examples of closed source software, you've got things like Windows, Netflix, Amazon Prime. Sticking with the creative stuff, you've got the Adobe suite, that's all closed source. All of these industrial grade, very polished pieces of software are all closed source. And that's often because these closed source pieces of software all have massive commercial backing, billions of dollars behind this, and that's partly because with closed source software it's much easier and much more established for you as the developers or the organization funding it to sell it as a service or a product. Now, gone are the days of paying $250 for an eternal license to use the software. Now you're paying, $30-40 a month to use it. I mean, that's us out of luck, but these companies are cashing it in, because if you're an Adobe suite and you're charging God knows how much they charge a month, I mean, what is it, like $70 or something to use the Adobe suite, or like the full thing, whatever it is. I mean, you're making a killing with that, and we're all kind of out of luck if we wanted to replicate that, because the source code is closed source. And then you have the open source alternatives to these pieces of software. For example, if we're sticking with the Adobe suite, which has, Photoshop, Illustrator, After Effects, you've got all these different programs which cover such a wide variety of things. You don't really have a direct open source version per se of that, but what you do have is a collection of open source software that can actually fill the roles that Adobe does. So for example, if we're thinking of a video editor, Adobe would have Premiere Pro, and for open source you would have quite a few different ones. So Kdenlive, Shotcut, they're just two examples of video editing software that are open source, free to use, free to analyze, free to distribute, and free to edit yourself, if you have the know-how, of course. And one thing that is brought up sometimes as well is if it's closed source but free to download and use, like DaVinci Resolve, there is a distinction between the word free when it comes to open source and closed source. So with open source free, as in free to do what you want with it. It is free. Free open source software. FOSS is also correlated with open source software. It is free to use, free to download, free in terms of, America free. It is freedom. Whereas with closed source software, of course, being closed source, it's just not as free. Saying all that, does it really matter, the whole open source, closed source thing? Well, for people who are in tech like me, it kind of does, because if it's open source, you have a much better idea of what is actually running on your system. Now, you can either go off of what other people have analysed and gathered about that piece of software, or if you know what you're doing, you can analyse it yourself. You can install these pieces of software, you can compile them to your system. You know what's running. Whereas with closed source software, of course, only the company, organisation or team of developers who developed it know what's running on your system. So for Windows, you've got certain levels of reverse engineering that can be done with the closed source code base, but by and large, all of the software is locked down. You don't know what's really running on your computer, and for a lot of people that doesn't really matter as long as they can get what they want to do done with the with the software they have. It doesn't really matter to them. I don't want any old code running on my system unless I say so. Vast majority of servers run on Linux-based systems. Linux, of course, the kernel at least is open source. Android, at least base Android, is open source, although Google are doing a little funny thing with closing off the development cycles between releases. So all in all, neither open source nor closed source is good or bad. They're just different ways of developing, releasing software, and distributing software. There are an extensive list of open source alternatives to closed source software, so have a little search on the internet, see if anything catches your eye. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.